morning. What a great worship team we have, huh? Thank you, guys. This morning, my wife, Simone, was watching a service from North Carolina, and it was beautifully done. Very much similar set that we have here. But she pointed out to me that there was a celloist in the corner playing beautifully. So she brought me downstairs, showed me this, and I really enjoyed it. But what I said to her, I said, yeah, but we have a banjo player and a violinist. Thank you, guys. Okay, I want to continue the topic of hope in our postmodern Christian world. This morning's theme, pandemic hope. Where do we find peace of mind in these changing times? As I look out at all your smiling mask faces, it's a little bit different. I think of the threat we all face now in our new normal, all right? How the very act of taking a breath can bring doom to all who are around us. Can these COVID numbers climbing like a Powerball lottery be accurate? Will things ever be the same again? Well, this morning I'd like to put our current situation in context with the past. I would like to show how our passage this morning, Jeremiah 28:8, says it all. Now, Jeremiah is, what are we talking, 8th century BC, okay? And he writes, "The prophet who preceded you and me from ancient times prophesied war, famine, and pestilence against many countries and great kingdoms." And this is what we are looking at now, how many centuries later? How war, famine, and disease have traveled together, the three amigos, war, famine, and pestilence. So often they're found, all three together. They're not always in the same sequence. Sometimes war brings on the famine, which brings on the pestilence. Sometimes it's the pestilence that brings on the famine, then there's a war. But those three are very common in our history. It has shaped our history, all right? And I'm going to point out this morning in a couple ways how it's still shaping our future, okay? Where do we start? I want to start with the breath that we are given. Genesis 2:7, "And God formed a man from the dust of the earth, and he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being." You know, we understand DNA and genetics and proteins and RNA and so forth. We know the chemistry. We are clueless about this breath of life. The jumper cables that it takes to start a life, to start a soul, right? Job 23 says it well. "The Spirit of God has made me, the breath of the Almighty gives me life." Or Job 12:10, "In his hand is the life of every creature and the breath of all mankind." And this one, Job 7:7. This one is for George Floyd. "Remember, O God, that my life is but a breath." When one dies in the Bible, in a Bible story, they usually always are said goodbye to when they give their last breath. Over and over, whether it's the patriarchs, whether it's their families, when they die, it's their last breath, obviously. And that's how it is referred to, their last breath. Some would say that we live day by day, or even minute by minute. Or we've all heard some live paycheck to paycheck. I would argue that we all live from breath to breath. Our lives are framed by our first and last breath. You could say that we're only threatened when we have to breathe, right? COVID wouldn't be an issue if we didn't have to breathe it, right? All right. How often is that? How often do we have to breathe? Have you ever stopped and thought, how many breaths do I take every day? Well, according to my research, my internet search, between 17,280 to 23,000 times a day. Let's just say on average, we will do 20,000 breaths a day, okay? If you're sitting here listening to me right now, you're probably breathing a lot less, no worries. It equates to about 833 breaths per hour, or about 14 breaths per minute. Please don't start counting now. You know, I never realized that we move that much air. Okay, some of us move more air than others. I know this. But imagine this. If there were, let's just say for conversation, 50 of us gathered here this morning, and I spoke for only 30 minutes, that would entail 21,000 breaths right here. Good thing we're outside. Good reason for short sermons. What do we do? What do? We stop and we smell the flowers. Anybody smell these flowers? These are the smelliest flowers that Simone could find. Now, we all have masks on. We're up here in the breeze. But how often do we get the scent of pine? All right? Well, I want you to think in your mind, visualize this, that these odors come to us on the air. And we now have the knowledge to know about viruses and how small they are. So if you smell the pine, if you smell these carnations on the air, remember that that scent particle is 100 times bigger than a virus particle. And that's why we're all smiling behind masks. All right? All right. Now, when we remember the science that tells us that this virus is so much smaller than the scent particle, you see, science and knowledge is what has finally changed history having to repeat itself, if we will only learn from our past. Our first story, and I don't know if I gave you the whole title. It's Pandemic Hope, Where Do We Find Peace of Mind in Such Changing Times? Or, and I love the second title, Christian Female First Responders Who Have Changed History. And I kind of want to dedicate this message this morning to our first responders, all right? I think they are the new patriot in America. Remember, the word patriot always meant a veteran, right? I think this is a great title for a group of our society that we have taken for granted maybe, that we didn't appreciate as much. Well, we should appreciate them now. They are overworked and they are taking way more risk for us every day than we can imagine. So this is to the first responders, okay? Our first story from the past is about a famous first responder we have all heard of. She was born in Florence, Italy in 1820 to a wealthy English family. Her name? Florence Nightingale. May 12th would have been her 200th birthday. Named after the city she was born in. At the age of 16, she experienced a religious awakening and was convinced that her destiny was to do God's work. She decided to become a nurse. Her parents, especially her mother, opposed that choice, as nursing in those days was regarded as a little bit disreputable. She and her older sister were both trapped in a gilded cage growing up, but only Florence would break out of it. And boy, did she break out. She mastered her profession. Well, she traveled widely across Europe and trained rigorously in caregiving. She did master her profession at the highly regarded Kaiserwerth Nursing School in Germany. She served as a superintendent of the Institute for the Care of the Sick in London. and she cared for prostitutes in the 1853 cholera epidemic. So she had some experience when in 1854, British troops invaded Russian-held Crimea. In 1855, Florence sailed across the Black Sea to inspect medical facilities on the front lines. You see, Sidney Herbert, the Secretary of State for War in England, happened to be a friend of the Nightingales. He knew Florence, and he dispatched her to the barrack hospital at Scutari, outside of Constantinople. There, thousands of wounded and sick British troops had ended up after being transported across the Black Sea aboard filthy ships. With just 38 nurses under her command, she ministered to troops packed in squalid wards, many racked by frostbite, gangrene, dysentery, and cholera. She worked relentlessly. Nightingale rankled commanding officers by going around them. British Army medical officers were enraged and would complain to London about Florence going over their heads to order needed supplies or complaining about the conditions. In that first winter at Scutari, she saw 4,077 British soldiers die. 10 times more died from typhus, cholera, typhoid fever, and dysentery than from battle wounds. She knew something was amiss. In her letters home, she pointed blame repeatedly at military doctors and administrators, chastising them for a host of murderous errors, sending cholera cases to overcrowded wards, not having the hospitals drained, ventilated, or even cleaned. Dwayne, can you imagine that scenario? It wasn't until a newly British government dispatched a sanitary commission whose investigation confirmed Nightingale's suspicions about the links between filth and disease. She became determined never to let those conflicts occur again, or those conditions. This is the foundation of all she does in public life for the rest of her life. And what she experienced for those almost 2 years on the front line would haunt her for the rest of her life. It's not described in her biography as such, but she came home with PTSD. We would know that today. She was not one for celebrity or notoriety. When she did return, her family didn't know until they were told that she was in her bedroom. She did not go out of her way to be noticed. But how can you not notice the woman with the lamp? Every evening, this woman with the lamp would make her rounds to all the clinics and hospitals, and she was noticed. The Sanitary Commission went as far as cleaning out the latrines, the cesspits, the flushed out sewer systems. They removed a dead horse that was polluting the water supply. These are common sense things for us today. Not so 160-some years ago. Within a few months, the mortality rate dropped from 42.7% to 0.2%. A quote in one of her letters, Nightingale writes, "Our soldiers enlist to die in the barracks." She had spent nearly 2 years in this conflict zone. Throughout, she faced the resentment of officers and bureaucrats who regarded her as an interloper. In her letters home, she writes, "There is not an official who would not burn me like Joan of Arc if they could. But they know that the War Office cannot turn me out because the country is with me." Well, how is that? How is this one caregiver with a lamp? How does a country get behind someone who doesn't have internet? All right? The country was behind her because of William Howard Russell, a renowned war correspondent. I have to stop here and say that the Crimean War was the very first time in human history that we had war correspondents. So the people back home were reading about what was going on firsthand. All right? He worked for the Illustrated London News that showed Nightingale making her rounds with her lamp, the lady with the lamp, selfless and heroic figure, caring for the troops. By the time she returned home, without a word, she was the most famous woman in England, after Queen Victoria, of course. She had very little interest in celebrity. What did interest her was the data, the numbers. With the help of William Furr, a mentor and noted government statistician, she gathered data from military hospitals that verified what she had long suspected. That nearly 7 times as many British, and this is at the end of the war, nearly 7 times as many British soldiers had died of dysentery than in combat. And that death rates dropped dramatically once hospitals at the front were cleaned up. What a revelation. She also collected data from hospitals in Great Britain. Guess what? They turned out to be no better. Swayed by her presentations. Now let's think about Victorian England and how one woman is going to sway a government. This is where we needed the PowerPoint. But we're mountain people, and we don't need no stinking PowerPoint. If it make you feel better at home, I'll get a pine cone for a clicker. All right, this is the famous diagram that Florence Nightingale put together. And her quote was, let their eyes see what their ears will not listen to. This was not an easy job. But the results were there. This is the quote that made me include her this morning. This is a quote said by an associate of her, Spiegelhalter, who worked with Nightingale. And he is quoted as saying, Nightingale came to believe that using statistics to understand how the world worked was to understand the mind of God. Well, there's 2 comments that I have to make right here and now. I mean, this is 18.5 centuries after Christ, and we're just figuring out communicable diseases. Something that has been affecting human history forever. The second thing that jumps out at me is how she would not stand for, she would not allow English politics to stand in her way. Is it not refreshing today to see science trump politics? And there were a lot of politics back in the day. She fought a hard battle. In 1858, she became the first woman to be made a fellow of the Royal Statistical Society. I don't know if that takes an operation. Wouldn't she be called a feline? She thought that healthcare was a right, not a privilege. She started the country's first nursing school in London. And concerns for society's disadvantaged shaped her initiatives for the rest of her life. That's our first responder. Let's talk a little bit about what we're dealing with, disease. The oldest disease we know of would be leprosy. We now know that this is a 10-million-year-old bacteria, been around for a while. The oldest known cases of plague are known to have wiped out Neolithic settlements not here and there, but literally all across Europe. Smallpox, measles, malaria, and rabies were among the oldest diseases to infect ancient man. From Africa, Europe, and Asia, war, famine, and disease were common occurrence. Malaria. We didn't know that it was transmitted by mosquitoes until 1902. I gotta mention rabies here. We will mention it again. It's one of the most deadly. It's not very contagious, unless we have a lot of dogs running around, or bats. But Pliny the Elder, in the 1st century AD, wrote about rabies. And he wrote a remedy for rabies. His remedy to cure rabies, that by the next day you had to smoke the hair off the tail of the dog that bit you. This is where the expression, hair of the dog, came from. All right? We've come a long way. All right? The other thing about rabies is that it's really the only virus that turns the host into a virus-spreading machine. They actually lose their minds and they start biting and spreading the disease, just like a rabid dog, okay? This is the source for all your zombie and vampire stories. Is probably traced back to rabies, okay? These have been around. We've been dealing with them forever. The oldest known virus that we have sequenced at this point would be hepatitis B from a 7,000-year-old human tooth. There have been 3 great world plagues recorded in 541, 1347, and as recently as 1894. All devastated humans and animals. The Spanish flu we've all heard of 1918, which started in Kansas. It killed more people in a year than had died in 4 years of the Great War. How did that play out back in the United States? If we had time, we would really be well spent here comparing what happened in Philadelphia as opposed to Detroit and San Francisco. The calamity in Philadelphia following their war bonds parade is a classic example that we could really pay attention to today. The difference comes down to who was appointed as a health official. In the other cities, they were actually doctors that held those positions. In Philadelphia in that year, it was a political appointee who had no medical training. We can learn from our past. Okay, this is all past. What about today? What are our current killers, if you will? In James Clark's book, Man is a Prey, he outlines the 3 biggest killers on the planet. The first biggest killer of humans are insects, mostly the mosquito. All the diseases that these bugs spread throughout the world. You know, when we stop and think about COVID right now, it's a world epidemic. We're not immune. But we're really kind of spoiled. We are used to being an ocean away from all of this stuff. I'll explain a little bit more. The second biggest killer of man, snakes. How many people here know of anybody with a snake bite? Simone, keep your hand down. It just doesn't happen here. But this is the number 2 killer. We don't have a black mamba. We don't have adders and vipers and cobras. We have to go out of our way to find a serpent, if you will. All right? And this is the number 2 killer. The number 3 killer of man is man himself. Insects, snakes, humans. In much of the world today, cholera, typhoid, TB, measles, malaria, bird flu, yellow fever, rabies, Zika, plague, encephalitis, hemorrhagic fever, monkeypox, Ebola virus, or brain-eating amoebas are still out there. We just don't hear about them too often. Deadly diseases we face here in America today. What are our threats? What's killing us? Number 1, by a long shot, cardiovascular disease. 1 of every 3 people die from cardiovascular disease. And that is twice as many people killed than the second killer, cancer. 1 out of 6 people die of cancer. And we're talking all the kinds of cancers, all right? Way down on the list, we have foodborne illnesses. In the United States, millions are sickened by foodborne illnesses with thousands of deaths. You know, this happens every year, and it just doesn't make the news as often. It's a common occurrence. Again, in this context, we hear these big numbers, and they're scary. We have to put them in context. We're a big country. We have a big population. We have over 300 million people. Big population, big numbers. For example, it took 10 years of U.S. deaths from fighting in Vietnam to equal 1 year of deaths on American roads. Some of these statistics we take for granted. We're not going to stop driving. Okay. How does COVID-19 compare with everything else out there? Somebody click the pine cone. This is a current list of the 50 most infectious diseases on the planet today. I'm going to leave this up. You guys can look at it later on. The reason I'm showing this is because I want to put COVID in context. Its two cousins, MERS and SARS, are on here. They are deadlier than COVID-19. COVID-19 is more a contagious issue than it is a killer. It does have its lethality, especially to specific people like myself, over 60, had respiratory issues. Yeah, it's not to be taken lightly, but again, we need to put it in context. Measles. Measles, I believe, are on the top here. They've always been around. We usually get it as kids. What makes measles different is its contagiousness. It has aerosols that live for longer floating around than most any other virus. That's why it is so contagious. We're starting to learn that COVID is starting to look more and more like measles as far as its contagions. It's less about surfaces, it's more about airborne aerosols, all right? This is important to know. Did we know this years ago? No. Did we know this a century ago? No. This is one of the reasons why we are so much better off today. Because we know, we have the knowledge, we have science. If we can get the politics out of the way, we are much better served. All right. Our second person that I want to talk about, I'm going to read right out of the book. It's too much to write. And I can't, it takes me days to type this stuff up. All right, our second first responder, we don't know near as much about her. Her name is Helen. She was born about 250 AD, 3rd century Christianity was brutal. The Roman Empire was starting to crumble, and the officials needed a scapegoat, and the Christians fit beautifully into that category. So in this situation, it's even more and more hazardous to claim to be a Christian. And yet, the movement is just growing and growing. How do we explain this? Okay, In the year, well, let's start this way. Claudius Gothicus, emperor from AD 268 to 270, emperor for only 3 years. He died of a direful pestilence, probably smallpox, measles, possibly. All right? Okay, I'll later. All right. Helena would have witnessed the epidemic that claimed the emperor's life. Now, we can say a lot of brutal things about the Romans, but one good thing is they kept records. We have a lot of records that confirm all of these instances, these stories. So, perhaps she joins this exodus from the city, abandoning the sick and injured. She's a young girl. She's almost old enough to get married, to have children. And there's a calamity happening. People are dying all around her. Her entire town is evacuating. All right? So did she join this exodus, abandoning the sick and injured, while Christians stayed to nurse and nourish them, faced death with fortitude, secure in their belief in salvation? Perhaps she was among those who offered care or became a Christian as a consequence. She most certainly did. This event changed her life. This event changed history. All right? As we shall see, she was the perfect candidate for Christian conversion. A young woman born into a provincial family of modest standing, approaching marriageable and childbearing age. The Christian writer, Cyprian, describes the effects of the plague which raged most fiercely between these years. I am not going to read this paragraph because I want to enjoy my lunch in a little bit. It's not pleasant. It in graphic detail describes the conditions the plague is causing. But this is what I do want to read. And on the fortitude with which Christians faced the disease, he proclaimed, "What a grandeur of spirit is to struggle with all the powers of the unshaken mind against so many onsets of devastation and death. What sublimity to stand erect amid the desolation of the human race, and not to lie prostrate with those who have no hope in God, but rather to enjoy, to rejoice, and to embrace the benefit of the occasion. That is thus bravery showing forth our faith, and by suffering endured, going forward to Christ by the narrow way that Christ trod, we may receive the reward of his life and faith according to his own judgment." Helena would become a barmaid, and she would marry a Roman officer. And that officer was not a Christian, but he tolerated the Christians, which was against his orders. Helena would remain a Christian her entire life. Her son would become Emperor Constantine, the first Christian emperor of the Roman Empire. Her son would end the persecution that Christians had suffered for 200 years. All because of an event from a plague, from a catastrophe. Would you bow your heads with me? Heavenly Father, we know your hand is with us. We know your hand is in our world today. Lord, I pray that we as Christians would have the fortitude of our forebears. I pray that we be a light, an example to others. Heavenly Father, I thank you that your imperfect servant can read your word. In your Son's name, Jesus Christ, I say thank you, thank you, thank you. Amen.